They said Ronan Kellerman had never apologized to anyone in his life, that a single nod of his head could end a man's career, and that the most dangerous thing in the city wasn't his money, it was his silence. So when a trembling waitress spilled an entire tray of red wine down the front of his suit at the most exclusive party of the year, every guest in that glittering ballroom held their breath and waited for the storm. Her name was Della Voss, 27 years old, a nursing student with chapped hands, tired blue-gray eyes, and a cheap black uniform that didn't quite fit. Nobody in that room knew she'd skipped dinner that night so her little brother could eat, or that back in their tiny apartment, a landlord's final notice sat on the table next to the last few dollars she had in the world. Nobody knew she was one paycheck away from losing her home, her nursing degree, and the only thing keeping the boy breathing. She dropped to her knees on that polished marble floor, wiped the wine with shaking hands, and whispered apologies while the party manager screamed that she was fired, that she'd pay for the ruined suit if it took her the rest of her life. And then the room went quiet because Ronan raised one hand, and everyone stopped. The man they whispered about in this city, the man with the faint scar along his jaw and eyes like gray steel, the man who ran an empire nobody dared to name out loud, looked down at this exhausted young woman, and he didn't see clumsiness. He saw the student badge pinned crookedly to her chest, the small bandages on her worn fingers, and the way she kept her chin up even on her knees. He told her to stand. He told her to follow him. And behind a closed door, away from the cameras and the champagne, he offered her something that made her heart stop. A fortune in cash, enough to erase every debt, save her degree, and protect her little brother's future. And all she had to do was sign one contract and pretend, for 3 months, to be his. She should have run. Any sensible person would have run, because you don't make deals with a man like Ronan Kellerman and walk away the same. And everyone in this city knew that people who entered his world rarely got to choose how they left it. But Della wasn't thinking about danger that night. She was thinking about a little boy asleep across town, about a promise she'd made at her dying mother's bedside, and about how far a good heart can be pushed before it breaks. What she couldn't have known, what nobody could have known, was that there was a line of fine print at the bottom of that contract she didn't stop to read, that a pair of eyes was watching her from the shadows as she stepped out of that room, and that this desperate girl, with holes in her shoes, was about to do something so unexpected, so quietly powerful, that it would crack open the coldest heart in the city and change both of their lives forever. Because sometimes the richest man in the room is the one who's starving, and sometimes the poorest girl at the party is carrying the one thing money has never been able to buy. Before we dive into this story, if you love emotional tales about kindness, second chances, and love found in the most unlikely places, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs it today. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep these stories coming. Now, let's get back to that glittering ballroom, where a spilled tray of wine is about to become the best mistake of Della Voss's life. The heavy wooden door closed behind Della, and the music, laughter, and clinking glasses from the party outside were cut off at once, as though someone had suddenly switched off the entire world. The private room was submerged in the soft golden glow of a single desk lamp, and in that moment, Della realized she was standing alone with the man whose name the entire city dared speak only in whispers. Ronan Kellerman removed his suit jacket, soaked through with red wine, and tossed it carelessly over the back of a leather chair as though it were worth no more than an old newspaper, then turned to look at her. It wasn't an angry look. It wasn't a contemptuous one. It was the gaze of a man who had spent his entire life reading people, slowly and carefully, as though turning the pages of a book only he knew how to understand. Della clasped both hands tightly in front of her stomach to stop them from trembling. She spoke first, her voice quiet but unbroken, saying that she was truly sorry about the suit, that she didn't have the money to replace it right now, but she would repay him, every last dollar, no matter how long it took. Ronan didn't answer immediately. He poured himself a glass of water, not liquor, and for some reason that small detail surprised her. Then he said, in a voice so deep and calm it sent a chill through her, that he didn't care about the suit, that he could buy the entire store if he wanted, and that he had kept her there for an entirely different reason. He sat on the edge of the desk, the light falling across the faint scar along his jaw, and began speaking in the measured tone of a negotiator rather than a man making conversation. He said he had a problem money couldn't solve. The powerful families in the city were pressuring him to marry, each of them pushing their daughters toward him like pieces on a chessboard, and he couldn't continue refusing them without eventually spilling blood. Della asked, almost before she could stop herself, what any of that had to do with a waitress who had just been fired. Ronan looked directly into her eyes and answered that if he chose the daughter of any one family, all the others would immediately become his enemies, and an outsider, someone who carried none of their names, was the only choice that wouldn't ignite a war. He needed someone to play the role of his lover publicly, before every camera and every watching eye, for exactly 3 months. In return, he would pay her enough money to erase every debt she had, save her nursing degree, and make certain her younger brother never had to go without a single dose of medicine again. Della stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to rise into her throat, and she asked the only question left in her mind, why her, when he could hire any beautiful woman in the city with a snap of his fingers? Ronan set down the tumbler, stepped closer, and pointed to the student identification badge, pinned crookedly to the front of her uniform, then to the small bandages wrapped around several of her calloused fingers. He said, slowly and deliberately, that it was because she had knelt to clean the floor without ever lowering her eyes. He said he had spent his entire life surrounded by people who bowed their heads in exchange for advantage, and tonight was the first time in a very long while that he had seen someone reduced to absolute poverty, who still possessed every ounce of her pride. Della turned her face away, her eyes burning, because the compliment had touched the place in her that hurt the most and also held the most pride. She thought of the yellow notice lying on the table, of the email from the school, of Toby's wheezing breaths in the night, and of the inhaler with only one last spray remaining. She thought of her little brother's face, when he asked whether the two of them were going to be all right, and of the strained smile she had given him like a promise. Then she turned back and asked about the conditions. Ronan pulled a thick stack of papers from a drawer, placed it on the desk, and said there were only 3 rules. The first rule was that no real feelings could develop, because this was a performance, and any performance that allowed the heart to become involved ended in ruin. The second rule was that she was never to ask about his work, no matter what she heard or what she saw. The third rule was that whenever he called, she had to come, whether it was day or night. Della read the contract through the exhausted eyes of someone who had spent far too many nights without sleep, the words swimming before her, and at the bottom of the page was a line of tiny print that she passed over in a single instant, too worn down and too desperate to stop and study it carefully. She didn't know that one day, those tiny words would break her heart. The pen felt as heavy as stone in her hand, but Toby's face appeared in her mind, and she signed her name across the page, with a stroke that trembled but remained firm. Ronan collected the contract, gave a single nod, then opened a small safe in the room, and placed a thick envelope of cash into her hands. He said it was an advance, clean money, withdrawn from the transportation company his father had left him, and that he never paid anyone with anything else. Della clutched the envelope tightly against her chest, as though she were holding a second heart, bowed her head, and walked out of the room on legs that no longer felt steady. The long corridor stretched ahead of her in silence, while the crystal lights in the distance continued to glitter, as though nothing had happened. She didn't see, in the hidden corner, where the darkness gathered most heavily, a figure who had been standing motionless for some time, or the cold pair of eyes quietly recording every step taken by the poor young woman who had just left Ronan Kellerman's private room, like a patient predator committing the scent of its prey to memory. That night, Della barely slept. She lay on her side atop the thin mattress, one hand resting over the envelope hidden beneath her pillow, as though she feared that the moment she let go, everything would dissolve like a borrowed dream. Before the first rays of sunlight had even reached the edge of the window, she was already out of the apartment, waiting in front of the pharmacy while the metal shutter was still being raised. She bought a new inhaler for Toby, then bought a spare as well, a luxury she hadn't dared imagine for a very long time, and when the pharmacist placed both boxes into a paper bag, Della had to turn her face away for a second to hide the heat rising behind her eyes. She walked home, knocked on the door of the apartment downstairs, and Mrs. Odette opened it wearing her old flowered apron, the widowed neighbor with silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, and hands that always smelled of fresh baking, the woman who had treated Della and her brother like family since the days when their mother was still in the hospital. In the kitchen, Toby sat perched on a chair, his cheeks puffed out around an enormous bite of pancake, and the moment he saw his sister, he cried out happily and held up a sheet of paper, covered with a crooked drawing of a bright red fire truck, its ladder stretching all the way into the clouds. He proudly announced that one day he was going to drive that truck, and he would save an entire building, an entire street, and Della too. She bent down and kissed his tangled hair, which still smelled faintly of soap, and told him that first he had to finish every bite on his plate, because no firefighter was ever allowed to be that skinny. Toby giggled, and the clear sound of his laughter seemed to brighten the whole little kitchen, as she watched him eat with such appetite, and saw the 2 new inhalers resting safely inside the paper bag. Della suddenly felt a strange lightness in her chest, the name of a feeling she had forgotten long ago. That morning became one she would remember for the rest of her life. She knocked on Mrs. Petra's door, and when the woman opened it with a face already prepared for an argument, Della quietly placed enough money into her hand to cover the 2 months overdue and the month ahead. Mrs. Petra froze, counted it once, then again, then a third time, her thick fingers pressing each bill as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing, and in the end she managed only a muttered, "All right then, we're even," spoken so softly it almost sounded kind. After that, Della took the bus to school, and walked into the financial office where she had once stood with empty hands and her head lowered in shame. This time she placed the remaining tuition on the counter, received a receipt as thin as a ticket, and was told that her eligibility to sit for the final examination had been restored. She stood in the middle of the school hallway, gripping the receipt tightly, and suddenly missed her mother so fiercely it hurt. The memory came without permission, carrying her back to that final night in the hospital room, where her mother lay beneath a web of tubes, so thin that the blanket over her body was nearly flat, while an unfinished blue wool scarf for Toby still rested beside her pillow, the knitting needle left caught in the final row, exactly where her mother's hand had stopped forever. That night, her mother had held Della's fingers with what little strength remained, and whispered in a voice that was faint, yet strangely clear, "My daughter, in this life you may be poor in money, but never let yourself become poor in heart, because a person's heart is the one thing no one can take unless you surrender it yourself." Della had nodded through her tears, and she had kept that promise through every hungry night and every humiliating day. Now, standing in the sunlit hallway, she whispered silently, "Mama, I'm still keeping my word. I've only borrowed one chance from fate." But the most beautiful morning of her life didn't end in that sunlight. When she stepped through the school gates, a polished black car with dark tinted windows was already waiting by the curb. A man in a gray suit stepped out and addressed her by her full name, in a voice that was polite but held no warmth at all. He handed her a hard-bound file and said Mr. Kellerman wanted her to review it, so both sides would understand that transparency was expected, then climbed back into the car and drove away without waiting for a reply. Della opened the file right there on the sidewalk, and with every page, her blood grew colder. It contained everything, the name of Toby's elementary school, and the exact hour classes ended, her hospital rotation schedule down to each shift, Mrs. Odette's address, Mrs. Petra's name, and even the old hospital debt from her mother's illness, complete with every red stamp, a debt Della had believed was known only to her and to the sleepless nights she had endured. In a single night, that man had gathered her entire life into his hands, neat, cold, and complete, like an inventory of property. Della stood motionless amid the passing crowd, the file trembling in her hands, and for the first time since signing her name, she asked herself with the full force of belated fear exactly who she had made a bargain with the night before. At that moment, the phone in her pocket gave a short vibration. A message from an unfamiliar number appeared on the cracked screen, containing only one line. "A car will collect you tonight. Be ready." The black car arrived to collect her at exactly the appointed hour, gliding silently through streets bright with lights before turning into a suburban district where the fences seemed to grow taller with every row of houses, and when 2 enormous black iron gates carved with the figure of an eagle slowly opened before the hood of the car, Della finally understood what Ronan Kellerman's world truly looked like. The estate appeared at the end of a long white gravel drive, a 3-story mass of gray stone, with towering windows glowing with warm yellow light, flanked by lawns, clipped so perfectly, they looked like velvet laid across the earth, while stone statues stood motionless among the gardens like sentries that never slept. And somewhere along the corners of the roof, she noticed the tiny red eyes of security cameras quietly turning to follow the car. The place was beautiful in a cold and forbidding way, beautiful like a fortress disguised as a palace, and Della found herself thinking that no one built a house like this to welcome guests. They built it to defend themselves. The moment she crossed the threshold into the marble-floored entrance hall, an entire staff was already waiting, and the hours that followed passed like a whirlwind she could recall only in flashes, hands turning her before mirrors, lengths of silk draped over her shoulders, her chestnut brown hair freed from its hurried knot and brushed until it gleamed beneath the lights. And when it was all over, the young woman in the gilded mirror looked back at her with familiar eyes, from within, a form Della almost didn't recognize. Yet in the middle of that whirlwind, one thing kept her skin prickling with unease. The old housekeeper. She first appeared at the foot of the staircase, a silver-haired woman with her hair pinned high, her back as straight as a ruler, both hands folded over a black apron. And from that moment on, no matter which room Della entered, the woman seemed to have been there long before her, standing silently at the edge of the light, saying nothing, doing nothing that could be clearly named, while her pale gray eyes followed Della without ever looking away, patient and attentive enough to send a chill along the spine. When Della politely nodded in greeting, the woman merely inclined her head in return, her expression unchanged, the kind of gaze that seemed to weigh, measure, and record every one of Della's movements in some invisible ledger. A young maid whispered that her name was Mrs. Ingrid, the longest-serving housekeeper at the estate, then quickly lowered her eyes as though she had already said too much. Della tried to dismiss the uneasiness, telling herself that wealthy people were always wary of strangers, but deep inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone in that house had been assigned to watch her. Ronan was waiting in the second-floor study, a room paneled in dark oak with bookshelves rising to the ceiling and a massive desk at its center. He stood with his back to the fireplace, and when he turned to see her in her new appearance, his gaze lingered half a beat longer than necessary before returning to its usual cold steel. He offered no compliment. He merely motioned for her to sit, then began speaking in the voice of a man passing down lessons that had been learned only through blood. He told her that from that night forward, she would be entering rooms where smiles were cheaper than daggers, and there were certain things she had to commit to memory if she wanted to walk out unharmed. She must never accept a drink from the hand of a stranger, no matter how harmless that person appeared. If she hadn't poured it herself or received it from one of his people, then it didn't exist. She must never answer any question about his work, whether the person asking was a kindly lady or a cheerful old gentleman. Her only answer was that she didn't know and didn't care. And the last thing, he said more slowly, looking directly into her eyes, was that if anyone at those parties claimed to be his friend, she was to remember carefully that the person was lying, because he had no friends. The words fell between them like a stone dropped into a deep well, and for a moment Della saw in the powerful man before her a loneliness so vast that she nearly asked about it, but she remembered the second rule in time. Then he opened the leather-bound planner on the desk and began reading through the events she would be required to attend. And when he mentioned one evening that conflicted with her hospital training shift, Della did what perhaps no one in that house had ever dared to do. She interrupted him. She said she was scheduled to work that night, and the shift couldn't be moved because patients didn't wait for anyone. You couldn't ask Payne to return the following week simply because she had a party to attend. The room went utterly still. Ronan looked up from the planner, and something very close to surprise passed through his steel-gray eyes, an emotion no one had likely been bold enough to awaken in him for a very long time. He studied the young woman sitting straight-backed before him, thin, with bandages still wrapped around her fingers, yet willing to place a wall in the path of Ronan Kellerman's will for the sake of patients she didn't even know. 1 second passed, then 2, and finally he closed the planner and said simply that the schedule would be arranged around her hospital shifts, but in return, She wasn't to miss a single one of the remaining events. Della nodded, and she didn't see the trace of something softer than a smile that briefly touched the corner of his mouth. At that moment, the phone on the desk vibrated. Ronan glanced at the screen, and his face closed at once like an iron door. He rose, told her to wait there, then strode from the study and shut the door behind him. The room sank into silence, broken only by the soft crackling of wood in the fireplace, and as Della let her eyes wander over the towering bookshelves, her gaze suddenly stopped on the wall behind the desk, where a concealed steel door had been left open by the narrowest crack, revealing a cold metallic darkness within, silent and inviting like a trap that was breathing. Della remained seated for a little while longer, both hands resting neatly on her knees like an obedient schoolgirl, telling herself that it was none of her concern, that the steel door belonged to a world she wasn't permitted to ask about. But the room was too quiet, and the soft crackling of the fire sounded like the measured ticking of an invisible clock, while the cold metallic gleam from the narrow opening flashed whenever the flames shifted, like an eye blinking her closer. She rose, meaning only to walk a little and loosen the stiffness in her legs, meaning only to look at the spines of the books, but her feet carried her around the massive desk instead, each step slower than the last, until she stood there, no more than an arm's reach from the steel door, close enough to see what lay inside. Her breath caught in her chest. On shelves lined with dark felt were stacks of cash piled one upon another, crisp, flat, and new. So much of it that it no longer looked like money, but like bricks forming a wall she might never be able to climb in her lifetime. And in the middle of that silent world of luxury, strangely out of place, sat a woman's wristwatch, small and delicate, its leather strap worn thin, its glass clouded, both hands frozen at some long dead moment in time. Della stared at the stopped watch longer than she stared at the money, unable to understand why something so old and ordinary had been placed in the most heavily guarded space belonging to a man who could buy an entire jewelry store. But she didn't have long to wonder, because just then, as she stepped back half a pace, the stiff corner of a folded paper inside her coat pocket pressed against her side, and she remembered the letter. The collection notice had been in her pocket since morning. She had shoved it there after checking the mail before taking Toby to school, promising herself she would think about it later. And now it had found its voice at the worst possible moment. She pulled it out with fingers that had begun to tremble, unfolded it, and the bold printed words struck her eyes for the 100th time. The debt from her mother's hospital bills, the sum that had hung above her for 2 years like a cloud that would never clear, accompanied by a cold warning that if payment wasn't made by the final deadline, the account would be taken to court. Court. The word meant legal fees, wages seized, Della Voss's name blackened across every employment record. It meant the nursing degree she was about to earn would become a beautiful piece of paper no one would dare accept. And directly in front of her, no more than an arm's reach away, was the answer to everything. Just one stack. In that wall built from money, one missing brick wouldn't make it collapse. The man might not even open the safe to count it for an entire year, while for her, one stack meant the end of 2 years of terror, nights without waking at the sound of a knock on the door, and the peace of knowing her mother no longer rested beneath a debt. Her hand lifted before she realized it, hovering in the air, her bandaged fingers trembling as they reached toward the shelf, so close that she could feel the chill of the metal against her skin, while a voice whispered inside her head that no one would ever know, that she would return it later, that this wasn't theft, only an advance on the very money he had already promised to pay her. But then, in the instant when her fingertips were no more than a breath away from the stack, an image rose unbidden from the depths of memory. The unfinished blue wool scarf, the needle still caught in the final row, and her mother's faint yet strangely clear voice returning to her. You may be poor in money, but never let yourself become poor in heart. Della jerked her hand back as though she had touched fire. She stepped away once, then again, her heart pounding wildly in her chest, tears burning at the corners of her eyes, and she understood where she had just been standing, and who she had almost allowed herself to become. If she took that money, she would be exactly what this world expected of poor girls who entered rich men's houses. And worse than anything, she would never again be able to touch her mother's scarf without shame. She stepped forward, placed her hand against the steel door, and pushed it closed with one decisive motion. the lock caught with a sharp, dry click that sounded like a vow. Then, right there in the study of the most powerful man in the city, she took out her phone, dialed the number printed on the collection notice, and when someone answered, she said in a voice that still trembled, but remained steady, that her name was Della Voss, that she was the daughter of the patient listed in the file, that she wasn't running from the debt, and that she was asking for an official payment plan, one fixed amount every month, paid regularly until the last dollar was gone. She had no idea that in the darkest corner above the bookshelves, where the shadows gathered most heavily, a tiny red light was blinking in silence, and a camera had captured everything from beginning to end, the hand reaching out, the hand pulling back, the safe door closing, and the call made by a poor young woman asking to carry her own debt. When Ronan returned to the study a few minutes later, he paused at the threshold for exactly half a beat, his gaze moving over the tightly closed safe before settling on her face, which had not yet fully regained its composure, and he looked at her longer than usual, long enough that Della lowered her eyes and pretended to straighten her sleeve, but he said nothing. He merely walked around the desk and sat down as though he had never left. And it was then, while she avoided his gaze, that Della noticed a silver picture frame lying face down on the massive wooden desk between the neatly stacked papers, silent as a small grave. And although the question had already risen to the tip of her tongue, she swallowed it because she remembered the second rule: never ask. Yet throughout the journey home that night, the image of that overturned photograph kept returning to her mind along with a question that had no answer, whose face was being hidden inside a house where the man who owned it had no friends. And why would anyone turn a memory face down, unless looking at it hurt more than forgetting? A few days later, Della's first public appearance came in the form of an annual charity gala, hosted by the Kellerman Transportation Company, held in a magnificent hotel ballroom where crystal chandeliers hung high above like constellations trapped in glass. And the guests were the strange mixture. Only charity events seemed capable of gathering beneath one roof: respectable tycoons, retired politicians, elegant ladies who practiced generosity through signed checks, and moving quietly among them, families whose polished smiles couldn't conceal the familiar darkness in their eyes. Della entered the ballroom on Ronan's arm, wearing the deep blue evening gown his staff had chosen for her, and in that first moment, she played her role to perfection, chin lifted, shoulders straight, smile measured just right, though no one knew that beneath the silk brushing the floor her feet were on fire. The stiff new high heels had been cutting into her skin since the moment she stepped out of the car, every step like the prick of a needle, and by the middle of the evening, when the blisters had begun to break, Della quietly slipped into a hidden corner behind a row of stone columns, opened the small cloth bag she had concealed, and replaced the heels with her own worn flats, the shoes that had carried her through countless night shifts, their soles worn through and lined inside with a carefully cut piece of cardboard. The dress touched the floor, she thought. It would hide everything. But she had forgotten that in places like this, there were always eyes trained to search for weakness in others. Cornelia Ashford saw the moment from behind, a woman from an old family, wearing 3 strands of pearls around her neck and a smile sharpened by 30 years of social gatherings, and she didn't let it pass. She approached when the crowd was thickest and called out in a clear voice loud enough for half the ballroom to hear, saying, "Oh my, the new lady of the Kellerman house, may I ask about your shoes?" And before Della could react, Cornelia bent down and lifted the hem of her gown with the tip of her folding fan, exposing the worn flats beneath the crystal lights, then laughed brightly and told the crowd that apparently Ronan Kellerman's standards had fallen to girls who lined their shoes with cardboard, and asked whether the Kellerman Transportation Company had truly fallen on such hard times. The laughter spread like oil across water, eyes dropping toward Della's feet, hands covering mouths, glances passing from one face to another, and Della stood trapped at the center of it all, her cheeks burning as though she had been slapped, suddenly aware of every inch of the old shoes beneath her, as if she had been stripped bare before 100 people. She wanted the floor to open beneath her. She wanted to run. But then, from somewhere very deep inside, she heard her mother's voice, poor in money, never poor in heart, and she did the only thing her pride would allow. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, looked directly into Cornelia Ashford's eyes, and said in a voice so calm it surprised even her, that those shoes had walked through more hospital night shifts than the number of parties Cornelia had attended in her entire life, and she saw nothing in them to be ashamed of. A soft murmur moved through the crowd. Cornelia had just opened her mouth to answer, when at that exact moment, a sound tore through everything. The sharp crash of a glass shattering near the main banquet table, followed by a woman's scream. Della turned at once. An elderly guest with snow-white hair and a distinguished bearing in a charcoal suit was clutching his chest, his face turning visibly gray, and he staggered against the edge of the table before slowly collapsing amid the rising cries of panic. The elegant ballroom suddenly became a flock of birds scattering from a broken nest, some guests stumbling backward, others frozen in place, ladies pressing hands to their chests and crying out, while no one dared to move closer. No one except the girl wearing shoes lined with cardboard. Della pushed through the crowd before she had time to think, her worn flats allowing her to run faster than any pair of heels in the room, and she dropped to her knees beside the man as all her years of study, every night shift, and every hour of exhausting clinical training surged through her veins like an army summoned to battle. She loosened his tie and collar, leaned close to check his breathing, then placed her bandaged hands firmly and expertly over his chest. Looking up, she swept her eyes across the stunned crowd and called out, clearly and forcefully, for someone to contact emergency services immediately and report a suspected heart attack, then pointed to a gentleman in a black suit and told him to bring the hotel's medical kit at once. Her calm, commanding voice cracked across the paralyzed room like a whip, and suddenly people began obeying. During the minutes that followed, each one stretching like a century, the girl they had mocked only 10 minutes earlier became the single axis around which the entire ballroom turned, her hands moving in a steady, controlled rhythm as she fought to hold the fragile thread connecting the stranger to life, sweat rolling down her temple and smearing the carefully applied makeup until the shriek of ambulance sirens sounded outside and the medical team rushed in to take over. After the man had been placed on a stretcher and his breathing had returned, his clouded eyes opened and began searching until they found her face among the crowd, and his thin hand closed around her bandaged fingers with unexpected strength. He whispered slowly, one word at a time, "Young woman, remember my face." Nothing more. Then the stretcher rolled away, leaving Della standing in the ballroom with those strange words still ringing in her ears. And in the thick silence of 100 people who no longer knew where to look, a deep, cold voice rose from behind her, clear enough to reach every corner of the room. Ronan Kellerman stepped forward and stood beside Della, his gaze moving across the painted faces, now turning away before settling at last on Cornelia Ashford, and he said that Della had just saved a man's life, while everyone else had been busy laughing at a pair of shoes. So perhaps someone could explain who in that room truly deserved to feel ashamed. No one answered. Cornelia's 3 strands of pearls trembled faintly as she swallowed. Della, her heart still racing from everything that had happened, suddenly realized that Ronan's hand had come to rest lightly at her waist, steady as a wall, warm as something she didn't yet dare to name. But throughout that night and many nights afterward, what returned again and again to her mind wasn't the warmth of his hand. It was the clouded eyes of the stranger and the words that had sounded almost like a prophecy, "Young woman, remember my face," because she couldn't understand why a man who had just returned from the edge of death would use the first breath he recovered not to offer thanks, but to tell her to remember him. The car left the hotel late that night, and Della sat silently beside the window, assuming it would take her straight back to the old apartment building as it always did. But at one intersection, Ronan suddenly tapped lightly on the partition and gave the driver a brief instruction, "Turn right." The old road and the elegant car glided quietly into a neighborhood the crystal chandeliers from earlier couldn't have imagined, even in a dream. Rows of low brick buildings, storefront signs blinking with weary light, and on the corner beneath the yellow glow of a street lamp, an old bread cart sent thick clouds of steam into the night, its wooden counter peeling, a string of small bulbs rigged beneath the canvas awning, while the rich scent of toasted garlic butter drifted so far that Della heard her stomach complain before the car had fully stopped. Ronan stepped out first and opened the door for her himself, and the man behind the counter, a broad-shouldered old fellow with a salt and pepper beard and an apron stained heavily with flour, looked up, saw him, and let out a rough laugh that carried across the whole corner, calling, "Good heavens, the Coal Wharf kid! What wind blew you back to this place?" Della stared in astonishment, because she had never heard anyone call Ronan Kellerman a kid and remained standing afterward. But Ronan only gave a small nod, and something loosened at the corner of his mouth as he said, "Amos, 2 orders, the way we used to have them," and the old man laughed loudly and told them to sit down. The chairs were still in the same place, and so the guest from the most magnificent charity gala of the year, dressed in a deep blue evening gown and her tired, worn-out flats, sat on a low plastic chair beside the most dangerous man in the city, surrounded by the smoke of toasted bread and the soft crackle of hot oil, and strangely enough, it was the easiest moment she had breathed through all evening. The bread arrived almost too hot to hold, its crust crisp, its filling generous, and when Della took the first bite, she nearly let out a quiet sound of pleasure, because she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten something delicious while truly hungry. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, and then Ronan spoke first, his eyes still fixed on the steam rising from the cart, asking why, when everyone else stepped away that night, she had run toward the man. Della wiped a crumb from the corner of her mouth, thought for a long time, then told him something she had never shared with anyone except herself during sleepless nights. She said that on the day her mother was dying in the hospital, she had sat beside the bed for hours, exhausted and numb, and late that night, long after the nursing shift had changed, a nurse who should have gone home much earlier came back into the room, not because she had any duty left to perform, but simply to pull up a chair on the other side of the bed, take Della's mother's hand as it slowly grew cold, and remain there, whispering gentle words to her as though she were family, until the very final moment, so that Della's mother left this world in the warmth of 2 human hands rather than beneath the cold noise of machines. Della said, her voice growing softer, that on that night she understood something, that medicine could lose, that there could be no more drugs left to give. But people weren't allowed to let go of one another, and she had chosen nursing not to defeat death, but to become the person who stayed behind for someone else on the darkest night of their life. Ronan said nothing for a very long time. He looked at her as though he had just found something he had spent years searching for without ever knowing its name. Then he set down the half-eaten bread in his hand and said in a voice deeper than usual, roughened at the final words, that he had once had a younger sister. Della held her breath and didn't dare move too quickly, afraid that even the smallest sound might cause the door that had just opened to slam shut again. He said her name was Marlowe, that she had been many years younger than he was, that her entire childhood had been filled with laughter, running through the hallways, and that she carried a strange belief no one could shake from her. The belief that inside every person, no matter how cruel, there was still something good waiting to be found. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly, making the faint scar along it seem darker, and he didn't explain how she had died. He only said one sentence, short and final, that sounded like a steel door closing in the middle of the night. I stopped believing that the day she left. Steam from the bread cart drifted between them, and behind the counter, Amos quietly lowered the flame as though he understood that this street corner was holding a story that needed silence. Then Ronan continued, slowly, like a man running his fingers along an old wound, saying that before his mother died, she had once taken his hand and told him something he had never dared think through completely. She had said, "My son, you weren't born to guard your father's darkness." He gave a faint shake of his head and said that he had been young then, that he thought she was only worrying too much, that some legacies weren't things a person could refuse, and so he had chosen to remain with that darkness, to guard it, to expand it, until he could no longer tell where it ended and where he began. Della looked at the man sitting on the low plastic chair, his shoulders slightly bowed beneath the expensive suit, and she suddenly understood that the person before her wasn't a kingpin, but a son who had wandered too far from his mother's final warning, just as she had once nearly wandered away from her own mother's words before the open safe. She offered no comfort, because she knew wounds like that had no use for words. She only said softly that his mother sounded like a woman who could see very far ahead. And then for the first time, since the night of the spilled wine tray, Della saw Ronan Kellerman smile, not the cold curve of his mouth from the negotiating table, but a real smile, faint and tired, yet deeply human, like a ray of sunlight slipping through the crack of a house that had been sealed shut for too long, and he said, almost to himself, "Yes, she saw farther than all of us put together, only even now, I still wonder what it was she had already seen." The following Saturday afternoon, Della was scheduled to attend the opening of an exhibition, and instead of sending the driver as usual, the black car stopped in front of the old apartment building earlier than expected. The door opened, and Ronan himself stepped out, causing Della, who was hurrying down the stairs with her bag in hand, to freeze halfway because she hadn't prepared herself for the sudden collision of her two worlds. Mrs. Odette was at church that day, and Toby was upstairs alone, waiting for Della to take him to another neighbor's apartment. She awkwardly explained that he would have to wait a few minutes, because she needed to make arrangements for her brother. But Ronan merely looked up toward the third-floor window where a small head was peeking out with curiosity, and said in a calm voice, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, "Then I'll come up and say hello to the boy." "We're not in a hurry." And that was how the most dangerous man in the city stepped through the peeling wooden door of the tiny apartment, ducked beneath the clothesline stretched across the entrance, and stood in the middle of a room that served as a living room, dining room, and study corner all at once, where the most valuable possession was a bookshelf made from salvaged packing boards, and found himself facing a little boy sitting cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, surrounded by brightly colored plastic pieces. Toby looked up at the tall stranger in the dark suit, neither frightened nor intimidated, only narrowing his eyes and studying him for a moment in the frank way children do, then asked directly whether he was a friend of Della's. Before Ronan could answer, the boy let out a sigh far too mature for his age, pointed at the pieces scattered before him, and complained that his fire truck was missing one part from the ladder, that he had been searching for it for 3 days, and that it was driving him crazy. Della quickly said, "Toby, don't bother him. He's very busy." But she hadn't finished the sentence when something unthinkable happened. Ronan Kellerman unbuttoned his suit jacket, tugged lightly at the crease of his immaculate trousers, and lowered himself to sit on the old wooden floor beside the boy, as naturally as though it were the leather chair in his study. Then he picked up one of the pieces, turned it slowly before his eyes, and said with absolute seriousness, "Report the situation. Which piece is missing, and from which joint? We'll search each area one at a time." Toby's face lit up as though he had finally found an ally. He immediately spread the crumpled instruction sheet across the floor, and in the small room filled with afternoon sunlight, an emergency meeting was called between a 9-year-old boy and a crime lord. 2 heads, one dark and one pale blonde, bent together over the red plastic pieces. One proposed that the missing part might have fallen beneath the cabinet. The other objected that the area under the cabinet had already been searched twice. Ronan suggested turning the storage box upside down and inspecting every crack through a process of elimination. Toby nodded thoughtfully and said, "You think pretty well." Della stood leaning against the kitchen doorway, still holding her bag, watching the scene before her, and unable to decide whether she should laugh or rub her eyes to make certain she wasn't imagining it. Just then, the door opened. Mrs. Odette had returned early from church and stopped by with a tin of cookies. The silver-haired woman stood frozen at the threshold for several long seconds, at the sight of an elegant stranger, lying with his cheek pressed against the floor as he peered beneath the bookshelf under Toby's direction. She said nothing. She simply placed the cookie tin on the table, stepped back to stand beside Della in the kitchen doorway, and smiled to herself with an expression Della could read as clearly as words. Then the moment came. Ronan pulled his hand from beneath the bookshelf, holding between 2 fingers a tiny red plastic piece covered in dust. He blew the dust away and presented it to Toby with the solemnity of a man awarding a medal. The boy shouted with delight, snatched the piece, fitted it into the ladder, and raised the completed fire truck above his head with a triumphant cry. Then he turned to his sister, pointed at Ronan with his whole hand, and announced with the authority of a judge delivering a verdict, "Della, this guy's all right." The entire room burst into laughter. Mrs. Odette laughed, Della laughed, and Ronan, a man whose smiles were as rare as rain in a drought, let out a real laugh that seemed to surprise even him. Encouraged, he cleared his throat and tried to tell Toby a joke, something about a chicken crossing the road, but he told it so badly it became a disaster, missing the rhythm, ruining the punchline, and making such a mess of it that Toby doubled over on the floor, laughing until he couldn't breathe. Not because the joke was funny, but because Ronan was so terrible at telling it. The boy's clear laughter spread through the tiny apartment and soon infected the failed storyteller himself, who scratched his head with an embarrassed smile. Della stood there watching her brother laugh until his face turned red, watching the man from those cold and guarded rooms sitting on the worn floor of the home she shared with Toby, holding an extra puzzle piece in one hand and wearing an awkward smile, while the late afternoon sunlight poured through the window and turned all three of their heads golden. Her heart stumbled for a single beat, only one, but it was deep and dangerous, because in that moment she allowed herself to dream, for no more than a second, about something the contract hidden in a drawer had forbidden her to imagine. Eventually, it was time to leave. Ronan rose and brushed off his trousers, accepted a high five from Toby, and promised that next time he would learn how to tell a joke properly. Then he and Della went downstairs while Mrs. Odette called after them to be careful on the road. But the car had traveled only a few blocks when Ronan's phone vibrated. He answered with his usual indifference, and Della, sitting beside him, felt the air inside the car change before she understood why. His hand slowly tightened over his knee, his jaw clenched until the faint scar stood out beneath the passing streetlights, and he said nothing except two short words, "Go on." When the voice on the other end finished speaking, the man who had been building a toy fire truck on a wooden floor 10 minutes earlier disappeared completely, leaving behind only a face of cold steel, staring through the car window into the darkness ahead, because someone had just informed him that, within his own organization, a traitor was quietly selling information to the outside. In the days following the phone call in the car, the atmosphere around the Kellerman estate changed in ways someone as observant as Della couldn't fail to notice. More men in black suits appeared along the corridors. Whispered conversations stopped the moment she passed, and Ronan, all but vanished behind closed doors, leaving only brief messages about the schedule. That evening, there was a reception they were required to attend together, and the car arrived earlier than usual because of heavy traffic, so when Della entered the estate, dusk had only just begun to settle, and the great hall was strangely deserted. No servants came to greet her. There was only the sound of wind moving through the long, hollow corridors. She waited for a while, then caught the faint sound of voices drifting from the row of buildings beyond the garden, a place she had never entered before, and she followed the gravel path toward it, intending only to ask where she should wait. That was the mistake, or perhaps the destiny, of that night. The storage building at the far end of the garden was lit from within, its heavy wooden door left slightly open, allowing a thin blade of yellow light to cut through the darkness. And from inside that narrow light came a voice Della recognized at once, and yet didn't recognize at all. It was Ronan's voice, still deep, but stripped of its final trace of warmth, leaving behind something flat and cold enough to sound like ice cracking across a lake in the middle of the night. She knew she should turn away. Every cell in her body screamed at her to leave, but her feet had gone still, and through the narrow opening she saw, in the middle of the empty warehouse beneath a single light hanging overhead, a middle-aged man knelt on the concrete floor, his face bloodless and drenched in sweat, his shoulders shaking violently, while Ronan stood before him without touching him, without raising his voice, both hands clasped behind his back, and it was that absolute stillness that made the soles of Della's feet turn cold. She heard him say, each word falling with the steady weight of drops of ice, 11 years, I gave you a home, a name, a place to stand, and you repaid me by opening the back door so outsiders could count every footstep inside this house. Then he bent down until his eyes were level with the man's, and asked so quietly that Della had to hold her breath to hear, Do you know what people used to do to men like you? The man collapsed even lower, striking his forehead against the floor and sobbing as he begged, his broken pleas tumbling over one another about his wife, his children, his mistake, one more chance. Ronan straightened and remained silent for a stretch of time that felt like a century, then delivered his judgment in a voice no louder than the wind. Because of those 11 years, I'll let you keep your life and your legs. But from this moment on, your name no longer exists in this city. No one will employ you. No one will shelter you. No one will even look at you. You'll be gone before sunrise, and you'll never let me see you again. And if you ever think of speaking to outsiders once more, Remember that my mercy comes only once in a lifetime." The man collapsed onto the concrete, not because anyone had struck him, but because something inside him had broken, the sound of someone who had just been erased from his own world. It was in that moment that Della stepped backward on instinct, her heel catching against a wooden chair propped beside the doorway. The chair crashed onto the stone with a dry crack that tore through the night, and through the narrow opening, steel-gray eyes snapped upward, cutting across the blade of light and locking directly onto hers. Della couldn't remember how she ran from the garden. Moments later, when Ronan found her panting in the great hall, she was standing with both arms wrapped around herself, trembling like a leaf, and the words she had been holding back burst from her before he could speak. "I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. I've spent years learning how to keep people alive, how to hold someone's hand through the darkest night of their life. But your world crushes a human being without touching them with a single finger." She told him she wanted to end the contract. Ronan stood still and listened until she had finished, his face revealing nothing, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He walked past her, opened the great front doors of the estate himself, and looked out into the night. In a voice that had softened but carried a weariness deeper than she had ever heard from him, he said, "You're right. This isn't where you belong. Go home. Keep all the money. Consider it payment showing me for show a few things money can't buy. The contract is finished. Neither of us owes the other anything." The night wind rushed through the open doorway and lifted the hem of Della's dress. The long white gravel drive stretched before her like an escape prepared in advance. She took one step, then another, reaching the threshold, and there, for reasons she couldn't explain, her feet stopped. She stood for a long moment between the light and the darkness, then turned around and looked directly at the man standing alone in the vast empty hall of his own home. Her voice still trembled, but every word stood straight as she said, "No, I signed my name. My mother taught me that a poor person's promise is the only possession no one can take away. I'll finish these 3 months, but remember this, I'm not staying for the money." Then she closed the door, shutting the night wind outside, and she didn't see the man behind her close his eyes for a very long moment, as though someone had just pulled a blade from his chest. That night, after the car took Della home, Ronan didn't go upstairs to his bedroom. He sat alone in the study without turning on the main lights, the silver picture frame still lying face down before him like a small grave, the bottle of liquor beside it unopened. When Mrs. Ingrid brought in the tea, placed the cup on the table, and withdrew without a sound as she always did, she paused at the threshold for a single beat, looking at his motionless back in the darkness, and quietly said the same strange words she had spoken many years before. "Young master, please don't forget. If there ever comes a night when you have nowhere left to go, return to the place I told you about." The door closed behind her. Ronan didn't answer or turn around. Only his hand moved slowly toward the overturned frame, his fingers resting on the edge of the cold silver, trembling almost imperceptibly, but in the end he still didn't turn it over. And in the darkness of that study, no one in the world knew that the man who had just destroyed a traitor without touching him didn't possess enough courage to look at a photograph. 3 days passed after the night in the warehouse, and the two of them didn't see each other. There were no messages about the schedule, no car arriving to collect her, only a silence that stretched long enough for Della to begin wondering whether he had changed his mind and quietly torn up the contract after all. Then, one afternoon as she came off her shift and stepped through the hospital gates into a fine misting rain, she saw him there. There was no black car, no bodyguard, only Ronan Kellerman standing alone beneath the awning across the street in a dark coat, the collar turned up against the cold, looking more like an ordinary man waiting for someone than a name that made an entire city lower its voice. He said simply that he wanted to talk, but not at the estate, and they walked in silence through 2 rain-slicked blocks until they stopped beneath the shelter of an empty bus stop, where the white light fell across both their faces, and the rain tapped steadily against the metal roof, like music accompanying the things about to be spoken. Ronan stared into the rain for a long while, then began in the voice of a man opening a vault that had been locked for too many years. He said that the other night she had asked what his world truly was, and he owed her an answer about why he had become the man he was. He told her, and Della stood listening in silence, forgetting even the cold seeping through her clothes. He said that his sister Marlowe, the girl he had mentioned on the night they ate bread together, died on a rainy night very much like this one. She had been young, healthy, and full of laughter, then suddenly fell ill in the middle of the night. The family rushed her to the nearest emergency room, and there, beneath the cold white lights, it wasn't the illness that killed her. His jaw tightened around every word, as he said that when they wrote her name on the admission form, when the surname Kellerman appeared on the page, he had later been told that the air in the room changed. Footsteps slowed, glances passed from one person to another. Whispers moved behind the nurse's station. "She's from that family. Get involved and there'll be trouble. Be careful or you'll bring danger on yourself." No one refused to treat her. No one dared refuse, but they hesitated, and in an emergency room, hesitation and refusal differed only in that one still allowed people to pretend they were innocent. He stopped, his breath turning white in the cold air, then continued, saying that by the time someone finally chose to truly fight for her, it was too late. Only a little too late, but for Marlowe's heart a little was everything. "My sister didn't die from an illness," he said, and for the first time, a faint crack opened in his voice. "My sister died because people looked at her with contempt." Della lifted a hand to cover her mouth as tears rose too quickly to stop. But what tightened her chest even more was what he said next, each word falling slowly and heavily, like a stone being set into place. "And that night, I wasn't beside her. I was in another city handling business for my father. They called me after it had already begun. I drove through the night. I ran down the hospital corridor just before dawn, and the only thing waiting for me was a white sheet pulled over her face. I don't even know the faces of the people who were in that room. I don't know who hesitated and who tried. I arrived too late, and that is the one thing I'll never forgive myself for." The rain continued its steady rhythm above them. Ronan looked down at his hands as though they belonged to someone else, and said that from that night onward, he swore he would make the Kellerman name into something no one would ever dare hesitate before again. He took on his father's darkness, expanded it, sharpened it, until the entire city lowered its voice whenever his name was spoken. And he believed that was what protection looked like, until a girl in her worn-out shoes knelt in the middle of a ballroom and saved a stranger without needing to know what name he carried. Then he understood that everything he had built over the years hadn't brought him any closer to Marlowe. It had only turned him into another version of the same contemptuous eyes that had killed her. Then he turned fully toward Della and told her the second reason he had come. There was something else she needed to know. The safe door in the study that night hadn't been left open by accident. He had deliberately left it ajar. He had ordered the camera installed. He had tested her, just as he tested every person who ever passed through the gates of his home, because he no longer knew how to trust anyone in any other way. He had sat and watched the recording, watched her hand reach out and then pull back, watched her close the safe and call to take responsibility for the debt herself. He looked directly into her eyes and said, "I'm sorry. That is the first time in my life I've ever said those words to anyone." Della stepped back, anger flaring hot at her temples, and said, "Do you have any idea how hard I had to fight myself that night? I stood before that open door and chose to hold on to my soul, while to you it was all nothing more than a performance caught on camera. You test people the way someone tests a lock." She turned her face toward the rain, her chest rising and falling, and remained silent for a long while, long enough for the anger to settle into something sadder. Then she spoke without turning back, her voice gentler now, but cutting all the way to the bone. "I understand why you became this way. I understand how deep your wound goes. But Ronan, you can't heal an old pain by creating new ones. You test other people's trust because your own was once killed. But every time you set another trap, you bury yourself 1 inch deeper inside the very rainy night you're trying to escape." Ronan stood motionless as though nailed to the concrete. The man who had never bowed his head before any gun lowered it before a sentence spoken beneath a bus shelter, and when he finally looked up, something in his steel-gray eyes had melted beyond any hope of hardening again. He nodded only once, but Della knew that single nod carried more weight than every contract he had ever signed. They stood together listening as the rain gradually softened, and when she thought every wall between them had finally fallen, she asked quietly whether he was able to trust anyone now. Ronan looked toward the street, gleaming beneath the lights, and remained silent for a long time. then answered in the voice of a man standing before the final locked vault he still didn't dare open. He said he was learning again, beginning with her. But there was one name he still couldn't bring himself to place on the scales, someone who had stood beside him longer than anyone else still alive, so long that doubting that person felt like cutting off one of his own arms. And tonight, he asked her not to ask him for that name. That night, the first cold winds of the season arrived, slipping through the cracks of the old apartment windows. And sometime after midnight, Della woke with the sixth sense possessed by women, who have spent their lives raising younger siblings as though they were their own children. She sat upright before she could clearly make out the sound coming from the next room, and the moment she stepped inside, she became someone else entirely. The nurse within her awakened fully, calm, warm, and steady as a safe harbor. She sat on the edge of the bed, turned the small lamp down until its light softened, placed a hand on her brother's back, and rubbed slow circles as she spoke in a voice gentle as a lullaby. "I'm here, Toby. Look at me. Let's play our old game. Breathe in with me like you're smelling a flower, then breathe out slowly, like you're cooling a bowl of soup. That's good. Just like that." One more time, she reached for the new inhaler on the bedside cabinet, shook it with practiced hands, and helped him take the medicine at exactly the right rhythm, as she had done hundreds of times before. But that night, her professional instinct told her it wasn't enough to simply feel reassured. Changing season was always the hardest time for him, and a child like Toby needed to be seen by a doctor that night, not the following morning. She knocked on Mrs. Odette's door, and the elderly neighbor hurried upstairs after throwing on a cardigan, her hands still carrying the familiar scent of fresh baking as they quickly folded a light blanket, poured warm water into a thermos, and straightened the boy's collar. All the while, she murmured tenderly that her little pup was doing so well, that they would go and have him checked so he could feel completely better, and tomorrow she would make banana pancakes. Toby, wrapped between the warmth of those two women, nodded obediently, still clutching his small pillow tightly against his chest. Della picked up her phone, her finger moving toward the taxi number out of the old habit of someone who had never had the luxury of other choices, but then she stopped. At that hour, a taxi would take far too long to reach their neighborhood, and guided by an instinct she couldn't explain, she pressed the name of a man she had never called before for anything personal. The phone rang only once and a half before he answered, fully awake as though he had never been asleep, and Della barely had time to say that Toby needed to go to the hospital that night before the reply came, brief and certain as an already open door. "I'll be downstairs in 10 minutes. It wasn't the driver, and it wasn't the black car with the partition. Ronan himself was behind the wheel of an ordinary vehicle, his hair still uncombed, and throughout the journey across the deserted city, he drove quickly but with extraordinary smoothness, avoiding every pothole as though carrying the most fragile thing in the world. From time to time, his eyes searched for Toby in the rearview mirror, while the boy sat nestled in Mrs. Odette's arms, wrapped in the unfinished blue wool scarf Della had brought like a talisman, their mother's scarf, the knitting needle still caught in the final row, now resting around the shoulders of the son she had never lived to meet. The moment the car stopped outside the emergency entrance, Ronan came around and opened the door, and before anyone could object, he lifted Toby into his arms and strode through the glass doors, his broad back beneath the hastily thrown coat dividing the cold white light of the night lobby. When the woman at the desk looked up and began the familiar procedural question, he spoke only his full name, clearly, and without raising his voice, and Della, standing directly behind him, watched that name pass through the emergency room like an electric current. Footsteps quickened, doors opened. The attending physician appeared so fast that even she was startled, and as she stood in the lobby watching the hospital bed disappear down the corridor, something became clear to her with such force that her eyes burned. Years ago, that same surname had made people hesitate beside the bed of a little girl, and this man had built an entire empire, trading away pieces of his soul, so that tonight no one in the world would ever dare hesitate again. Everything that followed moved quickly and smoothly. The doctors examined Toby carefully, adjusted his medication, and decided to keep him under observation until morning to be safe. Before long, in a warm pediatric room painted with blue whales, the boy was breathing evenly and sleeping peacefully beneath his grandmother's wool scarf. Near dawn, he suddenly opened his eyes, wide awake, looked around the room, and asked everyone whether they sold ice cream there. Mrs. Odette laughed until tears ran down her cheeks, while the nurse on duty surrendered at once and promised that when her shift ended, she would find the future firefighter a proper ice cream bar. By the time Della had settled everything for her brother, the sky had begun to pale. She suddenly remembered that the man who had driven them through the night still hadn't received a proper word of thanks, so she walked along the pediatric corridor, looking for him, and then stopped motionless at the bend. Ronan stood there alone in the half-lit hallway. No one knew for how long, perfectly still, before a large glass window overlooking a shared room where children slept beneath the gentle night lights. His hands hung at his sides. His shoulders no longer belonged to a crime lord, and on the angular face that had always seemed frozen, his steel-gray eyes were red, filled with tears he didn't wipe away, perhaps because he didn't even realize they were there. His gaze passed through the glass, through the small beds, and returned to some distant rainy night where a little girl had waited for a brother who hadn't arrived in time to hold her. Della remained silent at the bend in the corridor, one hand pressed tightly over her heart. She didn't approach or speak, understanding that there are moments when a person must be left alone with the dead they still carry. Then she stepped backward as quietly as she could, taking the image with her like a secret she would keep for the rest of her life, and he never knew she had seen him. By afternoon, Toby had been discharged with color back in his cheeks and a victorious ice cream bar in his hand. Ronan drove them all home, the car moving smoothly through streets beginning to glow with evening lights. But at the first intersection, his eyes narrowed in the rearview mirror. At the second, his grip shifted on the steering wheel, and Della, without turning around, noticed through the passenger side mirror a gray car following them, at a distance too precise to be accidental. It stayed behind them through exactly 3 intersections, and at the 4th, when Ronan suddenly turned in the opposite direction from home, the gray car didn't follow. It continued straight and disappeared into traffic as though it had never existed, leaving inside their car a silence both adults understood, though neither of them gave it words in front of the child in the back seat, licking his ice cream and humming softly to himself. The weeks that followed passed in such a way that, if anyone had asked Della to tell the story afterward, she wouldn't have known where to begin, because there was no single great event, only small things so harmless when taken alone, and so deadly when gathered together. It was one afternoon when she came home and found Toby loudly showing off a new building set, a rescue helicopter, a gift Uncle Ronan had sent over with a handwritten note in his sharp, precise script, saying that every fire department needed an air unit, and Della stood reading that note longer than necessary. It was a noon after her shift when she stepped through the hospital gates among the crowd, and found him waiting beneath the awning across the street, unannounced and without explanation, saying only that he had been passing by, though she knew perfectly well that no road Ronan Kellerman ever traveled happened to pass through that neighborhood, and the two of them walked side by side for 2 blocks, saying very little. Yet she returned home with both cheeks burning. It was the late-night messages asking how Toby had slept, the box of cookies Mrs. Odette received, with a note thanking her for caring for the brother and sister, the way he remembered that Della took her tea without sugar, the way his hand naturally reached out to shield her from traffic whenever they crossed a street. The man from the cold rooms kept appearing in places no one had required him to be, and Della's heart, carefully fenced in by reason in the contract, developed another tiny opening each day that she pretended not to see. Then came the night when every layer of pretending collapsed. Her final examination was drawing near, and the most difficult theory section, the one filled with tangled measurements and mechanisms that had defeated more students than she could count, remained before her like a wall of stone. That evening, she brought an entire stack of textbooks to the estate, because the schedule overlapped with a joint photography session. And when the session ended early, Ronan found her curled into a corner of the sitting room with a thick book in her lap and dark circles beneath her eyes. He said nothing. He simply pulled a chair beside her, picked up the book, read through several pages, and began to explain. To her surprise, he taught beautifully. The cold, incisive mind he used to command men and move entire operations took the complicated concepts apart layer by layer, arranging them neatly, turning dry chains of mechanisms into logical stories she could actually see. He was unexpectedly patient, explaining the same thing a second time, then a third, without the slightest irritation in his voice. Their heads bent together over the page beneath the warm lamp, close enough for their shoulders to touch, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of cedar from his jacket. And when she finally solved the most difficult problem entirely on her own, she cried out in delight, turned toward him with the triumphant smile of a child who had just won, and found him already watching her. It wasn't the assessing look from their first night. It wasn't the steel gaze he wore at negotiating tables. It was a light she had never seen in him before, warm, gentle, and so unguarded that he himself didn't seem to know it was there. They looked at each other for longer than one breath, longer than two, and then Della quickly lowered her eyes to the book, her heart beating like a war drum, and in that bowed moment the truth settled over her as softly and mercilessly as a falling leaf. She had broken the first rule. Not that night, but long before. Perhaps it had happened the afternoon he sat on the wooden floor, searching for the missing puzzle piece. Perhaps it had happened the night she saw him standing outside the pediatric ward, with reddened eyes. She had fallen in love with Ronan Kellerman. That night, Della couldn't sleep. She sat at the table, opened the drawer, and took out the copy of the contract she had carefully hidden away after the first night and never opened again. Beneath the light of the desk lamp, she read each page slowly, telling herself she only wanted to review the termination clauses, though the truth was that she was searching for some escape route for her heart. Then, at the bottom of the final page, she found what she had passed over on that desperate, exhausted night, the line of tiny print sitting quietly beneath the larger terms, the fourth clause. She read it once, then again, then a third time, and each time the words grew colder. In the event that either party developed genuine feelings beyond the scope of the agreement, the other party retained the full right to terminate the contract immediately. And the party in violation would be required to leave permanently, sever all contact, and permit no meetings, no letters, no exceptions of any kind. The paper trembled in her hands, or perhaps it was her hands that were trembling, and she could no longer tell the difference because the meaning of those words stood naked before her. If she spoke the truth of what she felt, even through a single glance caught at the wrong moment, she wouldn't merely lose the role. She would lose him forever. She would lose even the right to stand near him, to see him smile, and Toby would lose those afternoons of shared laughter with him. The clause had clearly been written for people like her, and bitterly enough, it now trapped her inside one unbearable choice: love him in silence or lose everything. So beginning the next day, Della started building walls. She answered his messages later, and with fewer words. She blamed her examinations and declined the walks after her shifts. She returned to calling him Mr. Kellerman, a formality she hadn't used in a long time. It reached its peak that weekend, when he came to collect her for an event carrying a box of the tea she liked, and stood in the doorway asking the simple question, "How has your week been?" Della forced a polite, professional smile, the kind she used with difficult patience to maintain a safe distance, though her heart ached inside. She accepted the tea and said softly, "I'm doing well, thank you. But with the contract coming to an end soon, Mr. Kellerman, I think it's best we remain mindful of our boundaries. We wouldn't want the performance to blur into reality." She watched it happen before her eyes, little by little, the warm light in his gray eyes dimming as though someone were slowly turning down a lamp, his jaw tightening, his back straightening, and the mask of ice she had fought so hard to break falling back over his face, flawless and sealed tight, exactly as it had been on the first night. He nodded and said she was right, thanked her for reminding him, then turned away. Della stood behind the closed door with her back pressed against the cold wood, both hands clamped over her mouth to keep the sobs from escaping, crying over a cruelty so twisted that she had been forced to wound the heart of the man she loved just to remain near him. And through her tears, one question kept rising, no matter how hard she tried to bury it. Who had written that fourth clause, and what could someone possibly fear so deeply that they would place an official prohibition over their own heart? It happened one weekday afternoon, at the little cafe near the school gates, where Della often sat studying between hospital shifts. She was bent over a stack of notes beside a cup of tea that had long since gone cold when a shadow crossed the table, and someone pulled out the chair opposite her without asking permission. When she looked up, she saw a man close to Ronan's age, perhaps a few years older, dressed in an impeccably tailored silver-gray suit, his hair swept back and gleaming, and a smile as smooth as oil spreading across water, the kind of smile already in place before there was any reason to use it. He introduced himself in a voice sweet enough to pour like honey. "Miss Voss. What a pleasure. My name is Silas Brandt. You might call me the right hand of the man you're dating. Or, to be more precise," he paused deliberately, his eyes glittering, "the man you're being paid to date." Della went rigid, her hand closing instinctively over her notebook. She asked what he wanted, her voice remaining calm even as her heart missed a beat, and Silas smiled more broadly, praising her for being direct, saying good. He liked people who didn't waste time. Then he placed a slim black leather briefcase on the table, turned it toward her, released the 2 brass clasps with a pair of sharp clicks, and lifted the lid just far enough for Della to see inside. Crisp stacks of new bills were packed tightly together like bricks. More money than she had seen inside Ronan's safe that night, enough for her and Toby to live an entire lifetime, without looking at a price before looking at the thing they wanted. Silas lowered his voice to the intimate whisper of a man sharing a business secret and said that his request was a small one. There was a burgundy leather-bound ledger in Ronan's study. It wasn't kept in the safe. The safe was for people to look at. That ledger was hidden far more carefully. She was the only person besides Ronan himself who was allowed to move freely through the room. All she had to do was find it and burn it, or bring it back to him. Once it was done, the briefcase would be hers. No one would know. No one would be hurt. Everyone would be happy. Della studied him and asked why a right-hand man needed to bribe an outsider to steal a book from his own master's house, and for a fraction of a second, Silas's smile thinned by the width of a hair. He said she was smarter than she looked. Let us simply say that the ledger contained notes about him. Notes one brother should never have kept about another. Ronan called it insurance. Silas called it a knife held against the back of his neck for more years than he cared to count, and he was tired of living with the blade. Della closed the briefcase and pushed it back toward him, saying that he had chosen the wrong person. Silas leaned into his chair and looked at her as though she were an amusing little animal, then played his next move. "So you're that loyal to him, are you? How touching. But let me tell you something true about that man. You think he means any of it. You think the walks, the boxes of tea, the little building sets are real. They're all part of the script. I've stood beside him longer than anyone still alive. I've watched him perform this same act in games both large and small. When the contract expires, he'll throw you away like a sheet of paper that has served its purpose, without so much as looking back. You'll return to your peeling apartment building, and he'll replace you with some other woman better suited to the next game. That is how our world works, young lady. Don't wager your heart in a gambling house where you haven't even been dealt a hand." The words poured directly into Della's newest wound, into the same place she had struck when she built the wall between herself and Ronan, and she hated herself for allowing them to seep inside, even for a second. But she still rose, gathered her notes into her bag, and said in a voice that wasn't loud but carried enough steel that she didn't know what stood between the two men, and she didn't need to know. Her answer was no. It was no today, and it would still be no tomorrow. Silas didn't become angry, and that was the most frightening thing of all. He only nodded thoughtfully, like a chess player watching his opponent make the exact move he had expected. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, drew out a photograph, and placed it neatly on the table before her. The blood in Della's body turned cold. It was a clear photograph of her, taken from no great distance. She wore her old coat and held Toby's hand as they crossed the marked street in front of his elementary school on some morning, when she had never known a camera was there. Silas said nothing about the child. He didn't need to. He merely tapped one finger against the corner of the photograph, against Della's own face, and said in the same honeyed voice, "Miss Voss, you have more to lose than you realize." Then he stood, fastened the button of his jacket, lifted the leather briefcase, and offered his final words as lightly as a farewell. "Think about it. There's no need to rush, but don't take too long. And by the way, don't waste your effort telling him. I always prepare for the answer no, Miss Voss. Always." He turned and walked toward the door, and at that exact moment, as his hand pushed against the glass and the midday sunlight slanted inside, something flashed on one of his fingers, an old-fashioned gold ring, set with a carved signet stone. Della stood frozen in the middle of the cafe because she had seen that ring somewhere before. Her memory raced backward wildly, then stopped at an afternoon in the study at the estate. The only time she had ever seen the front of the silver picture frame. Mrs. Ingrid had come in to clean the desk and lifted the overturned photograph for only a few seconds to wipe away the dust beneath it. Only a few seconds, but long enough for the image to burn itself into Della's memory. It was an old family photograph faded with age, showing a teenage boy with steel gray eyes standing beside a light-haired little girl, whose eyes were squeezed shut with laughter, and behind the two children, with one hand resting on each of their shoulders, stood an older young man with a broad smile, wearing that exact gold signet ring on his finger, the ring in the photograph that had remained face down for years on Ronan's desk, and the ring that had just flashed in the cafe doorway were the same. Della sank back into the chair, her breathing growing shallow, because she had just understood something that sent a chill through her spine. The man who had placed her photograph on the table and smiled at her with a voice as sweet as honey wasn't merely a disloyal subordinate. He had once stood inside the only family photograph Ronan Kellerman kept on his desk. He had once laid a hand on Marlowe's shoulder. He had once been family. Della remained in the cafe for a long time after Silas had disappeared from sight, the tea before her completely cold, his warning still circling in her ears. Don't waste your effort telling him. And she understood that it hadn't merely been advice. It was a test already built into the trap. A man like Silas surely had eyes and ears around Ronan. Telling him would mean stepping into a game whose entire board she couldn't see. Silence would be safer for her, for Toby. All she had to do was lower her head, finish studying, complete what remained of the contract, then disappear from the world of gold rings and leather briefcases. But then she remembered Ronan's face beneath the bus shelter on that rainy night. Remembered him saying that he was learning how to trust someone again, beginning with her, and she knew that if she remained silent tonight, then every wall she had built because of that fourth clause would mean nothing, because she would no longer be someone worthy of standing behind those walls. That evening, she went to the estate without warning, walked directly to the study, and told him everything. From the smile as smooth as oil, the leather briefcase filled with money, the burgundy leather-bound ledger, to the words she had thrown back at Silas before he left, that he had chosen the wrong person, because some things in this world weren't for sale. She spoke evenly and concisely, as though reading from a medical chart, withholding only one detail, the photograph, because she wanted to see his reaction first. And Ronan's reaction stunned her because it wasn't anger. He stood motionless beside the fireplace for a long time, then, as though someone had removed his spine, slowly lowered himself into the armchair and covered half his face with one hand. When he spoke, his voice wasn't cold or sharp, only so tired and sorrowful that Della felt an ache somewhere inside her chest. Do you know who Silas is to me? He isn't an employee. He isn't an associate. My father found him on the streets when he was a starving boy, gave him the surname Brandt so he wouldn't carry the shame of being called illegitimate, and raised him in this house as though he were his own son. He was always 2 steps ahead of me growing up. He taught me how to climb trees. He taught me how to bandage cuts so my father wouldn't find out. And Marlowe. He stopped, his throat moving with difficulty. Marlowe clung to him even more than she clung to me. He used to carry her on his shoulders through the garden outside. She would laugh until she couldn't breathe up there, in the same garden, where he now has people counting every one of my footsteps. He lowered his hand from his face and stared into the fire as he continued, saying that after the night Marlowe died, everyone in that house broke in a different way. I turned to stone. Silas turned hungry. He became hungry for power, the way other people hunger for food. He told me that the Kellerman family had lost because we weren't frightening enough, and I let him take control of the parts of the business I no longer wanted to sink deeper into. I knew he was going too far somewhere, so I created that ledger, not to destroy him, but so that one day I might be able to pull him back and make him stop. But it seems that what I considered a break, he considered a knife. And Della finally understood why he had said that doubting that person felt like cutting off one of his own arms. Then she took the photograph from her bag and placed it on the desk between them, without saying a word, and she watched the transformation move across Ronan's face, like water freezing in a single second. The grief vanished, replaced by a stillness more terrifying than anything she had seen in the warehouse that night. He picked up the photograph and stared at the image of her holding the child's hand while crossing the street, his knuckles turning white against the edge of the paper. Then he laid it down, flat and perfectly straight, with the careful precision of a man using every ounce of his will, not to crush what he held. When he spoke, each word fell like the blow of a cold hammer. My world is filthy. I've never denied that. We deceive one another, stab one another, bury one another. But that world continues to stand because of one law no one is permitted to break. Children are never touched. They aren't photographed. Their names aren't spoken. They aren't used as pieces in a game. Anyone who breaks that law no longer belongs to any world at all, and Silas has just broken it. He rose, walked to the window, and took out his phone, and during the next 10 minutes, Della heard him give brief instructions in a voice no louder than the wind. From the fragments she understood that beginning that night, men would quietly be stationed around her apartment building, around the elementary school gates, and even around Mrs. Odette's home, men Toby would never see. The boy's life would remain filled with banana pancakes, building sets and ice cream bars, and not a single shadow would be allowed to reach him. Ronan turned back toward her and said that she and the boy would be safe. I promise. And Della knew that a promise from that man carried more weight than every notarized document in the world. Then the air in the room softened. Ronan looked at her for a long time, so long that she had to grip the strap of her bag tightly to remain still. And when he spoke, his voice had returned to its low warmth, though something inside it sounded fractured. Do you know what I can't stop thinking about? That briefcase contained enough money to make people sell their fathers, their brothers, even their souls. I've spent my entire life among those transactions, so I know. People pay fortunes to purchase betrayal, and you refused it as though you were refusing a cup of cold coffee. Then today, you walked straight through his threat and came here to tell me. Della turned her face away before his eyes could reach what she was hiding, and she heard him say softly, almost to himself, "If only you knew what that means to a man like me." She took her leave when the clock had already struck midnight, and his car drove her home to the foot of the apartment building. She had only stepped onto the first stair when the phone in her pocket vibrated. An unfamiliar number glowed across the cracked screen. She answered automatically, thinking it might be the hospital changing her shift, but from the other end came the voice of a man she hadn't heard in nearly a decade, a voice aged and roughened, yet instantly recognizable through the instinct of a child who had once stood behind a window waiting for those footsteps to return. And that voice spoke with a sweetness that pretended all those years had never passed. "Hello, daughter." Della stood rooted to the dark stairway, the phone pressed to her ear, and for several seconds that felt as long as a lifetime, she couldn't force out a single word, while the voice on the other end continued flowing smoothly. He asked how she had been, said he heard she was about to become a nurse, that her mother would have been so proud if she were still alive, then clicked his tongue and mentioned Toby, saying the boy must be so big by now, that he had heard his lungs were weak, poor child, and children like that needed a proper home, a man in the house. Della still had her whole future ahead of her, so perhaps she should let him take the boy and raise him for a while. He was settled now, and there, beneath those syrupy words, Della heard the ice cracking under her feet, because this man had walked away when Toby was still an infant, had never sent a card, had never known which school his son attended, yet now he knew Toby had weak lungs, knew she was about to take her nursing examination, knew things only someone who had read a file on her, or had ordered photographs taken outside the school gates, could possibly know. She gripped the phone until her knuckles turned white and asked directly, in a voice colder than she knew she possessed, "Who gave you this number, and who paid you?" The line went silent for half a second, only half a second, but that was answer enough. Then he gave a false little laugh and said, "What a strange thing to ask, I'm your father." Della ended the call and leaned against the freezing railing, understanding that Silas had told the truth about at least one thing. He always prepared for the answer no. When he couldn't buy her with the leather briefcase, he went searching for the one weapon capable of bringing her to her knees, and that weapon wore her father's face. She intended to tell Ronan everything the next morning, but she never received the chance, because that very night, the night the newspapers would later call by many names, Ronan Kellerman's world collapsed. Della's refusal and immediate journey to the estate had told Silas everything he needed to know, that he had been exposed, that the burgundy leather-bound ledger had become a time bomb counting down above his head, and a man like Silas didn't sit still and wait for a bomb to explode. He pulled the trigger first, earlier than planned, but with a machine that had been oiled for a very long time. In a single night, the doors within the Kellerman empire changed hands one after another, without a gunshot. Men who had been taking Silas's money for longer than anyone knew all turned at once. Forged signatures and documents prepared with exquisite care were sent simultaneously to the police, the press, and the families, all of them telling the same story written in advance, that every darkest operation in the organization had long been directed personally by Ronan Kellerman, while Silas Brandt was merely an honest employee who had bravely stepped forward to expose his master. Accounts were frozen. The estate was overrun and seized by Silas's men before dawn, and the crushing machine Ronan had spent years building turned suddenly and aimed itself at him. Ronan received a final warning call from one of the few men who remained loyal while he was driving back to the estate. He heard only a few words, "Don't go home, they're already there," before two vehicles without headlights appeared behind him. The chase tore through the driving rain, headlights smearing across the wet road, Ronan's car cutting through rows of dark suburban streets, and at a sharp bend where the road followed the embankment, another vehicle burst from a shadowed side street and rammed into him. Metal ground against metal with a long, screaming shriek. Ronan's car skidded, spun sideways, struck the guardrail, and came to a halt in a thin cloud of smoke. When figures poured from the other two vehicles, they found only the car door hanging open, the driver's seat empty, and several dark stains spreading across the upholstery as the rain slowly washed them away. The man hunted by the entire city had vanished into the black alleys along the embankment, one hand clamped over his injured shoulder, leaving behind the car, the phone he had thrown into the water so no one could trace him, and the whole of his empire. He escaped with nothing but his bare hands. No, not entirely nothing, because during that shattered night, between two changes of hiding place, he managed to do one final thing, to leave behind one object in the hands of the only person on earth he still dared trust. What that object was and who that person might be, the rainy night kept hidden. By morning, the earthquake had erupted across every newspaper and every screen. The Kellerman empire had fallen in a single night. Its heir was accused of running an entire criminal network and was now a fugitive. The police issued an urgent notice seeking him for questioning. Accompanied by a photograph of the angular face and steel-gray eyes, the city now viewed in an entirely different way. Della heard it all from the television mounted in the corner of the hospital waiting room during her clinical shift. The tray of instruments in her hands began to tremble, the stainless steel clamps striking one another with small, bright sounds, and she had to set the tray down quickly on the cart, excuse herself, and step into the empty stairwell. There, with fingers that no longer obeyed her, she called his number, only to hear a lifeless recorded voice repeating that the number she had dialed didn't exist. She called again, then again. The answer remained the same. The man who had told her only days before that he was learning how to trust someone again, beginning with her, had vanished from the world as though he had never existed. Della moved through that entire day like someone who had lost her soul. She finished her shift, collected Toby, cooked dinner, answered Mrs. Odette with sentences that came at the wrong moments, and never took her eyes from the silent phone on the table. Then, when the city lights had come on and Toby was deeply asleep, the phone suddenly lit up once, and only once. A message from an unfamiliar number she had never seen before. There was no greeting and no signature, only an address buried deep in the abandoned industrial district on the eastern edge of the city, and two final words that made her heart tighten and pound wildly at the same time. Come alone. Della sprang to her feet in the dark room as 100 thoughts spiraled through her at once. She wanted desperately to believe it was him, but one cold fact rose and blocked her throat. She had heard the news report say that his phone had been recovered beneath the embankment. Ronan no longer had a phone, no longer had her number, no longer had anything at all. So who had sent the message? Della sent Toby to sleep at Mrs. Odette's apartment with some hurried excuse, then took the final 2 buses of the evening toward the eastern side of the city, where abandoned factories stood in rows beneath the darkness like the skeletons of giants. She followed the address in the message to an aging building tucked behind a line of rusted fences, climbed 3 flights of unlit stairs, using the glow from her phone, and stopped before a faded wooden door at the end of the corridor. She knocked 3 times, her heart pounding in her throat. The door opened by a narrow crack, and in the darkness beyond it appeared a pair of steel-gray eyes that had lost every trace of steel. Ronan stood there inside a hollow apartment containing only an old mattress, a wooden table, and one sickly yellow lamp. His wrinkled shirt hung loosely from his left shoulder, where a clumsily wrapped bandage had already darkened with old blood. His angular face was covered with rough stubble and something deeper than exhaustion, the face of a man who had been cast out by his entire world. The first thing he said wasn't a greeting. "You shouldn't have come. Leave now. Staying near me is the same as setting fire to your own life. I have nothing left to give you. The contract is dead. The money is gone. Go." Della didn't answer. She stepped across the threshold, set her cloth bag on the floor, and the nurse's hands within her began to work as though this were only another shift. She pulled him down onto the edge of the mattress with a firmness that allowed no refusal, removed the badly wrapped bandage, cleaned the wound on his shoulder with the antiseptic she had brought, and moved her bandaged fingers with practiced care, decisive yet gentle, binding the injury properly, in neat, even layers. Then she walked into the corner that served as a kitchen, struck the old gas stove until it clicked into flame, set a pot of water over it, and before long the smell of hot noodles rose through the cold apartment, warm and defiant as her presence. She placed the steaming bowl into his hands and said simply, "Eat. No one can think properly on an empty stomach." And the contract that had once bound those 2 people truly was dead, killed on the night the empire collapsed, when the man who had hired her no longer possessed anything with which to pay, while the woman who had been hired sat there for no clause, no condition, and no payment at all. He ate in silence with his head lowered like a child, and when the bowl was empty, Della took 2 things from her cloth bag. The first was a thin savings book with curled corners. She placed it in his hand and said there wasn't much inside, only money she had saved from extra shifts and what remained of his advance. But it was enough for food, shelter, and a decent lawyer while he found a way to stand again. Ronan stared at the book as though it couldn't possibly exist, shook his head and pushed it back, saying that he couldn't take the final dollars from someone who had already been poor because of him. But Della closed his hand firmly around it and brought out the second thing, the unfinished blue wool scarf. She rose and gently draped it around his shoulders, and the man who had once commanded an entire world sat there shivering beneath the unfinished scarf of a poor mother who had died years before. His fingers touched the final row of wool, where the knitting needle still remained caught like a breath that had stopped halfway through, and Della spoke softly, though every word went straight into the deepest place inside him. "My mother never had the chance to finish it, but unfinished doesn't mean worthless. People are the same, Ronan." A very small sound broke somewhere inside the man's chest. The final wall, the wall that had remained standing through the death of his sister, the death of his mother, and the betrayal of his brother, collapsed without any great noise. He lowered his head onto her shoulder and wept like a boy who had been forced to become a man far too soon, his broad shoulders shaking beneath the wool scarf. Between his broken breaths, she heard him say, "You're the only real thing I've ever had." Della held him, one hand patting his back the way she soothed Toby on nights when the weather changed, and allowed her own tears to fall into his hair. When the storm within him had finally eased, she told him the rest of what he needed to know. About the syrupy phone call from the father, who had vanished when Toby was still an infant, and about the notice she had received that afternoon. He had formally petitioned the court for custody of Toby. Ronan sprang upright, the old fury flashing in his eyes, his hand instinctively reaching for a phone that no longer existed. Then he stopped, and Della saw something she had never seen before. Ronan Kellerman was powerless. He sat back down and opened both empty hands before him, saying in a shattered voice that before one phone call would have been enough. Only one. But now he had nothing. And even if he still did, he said, looking up at her, "Even if I still had it, I wouldn't want to win for you that way anymore." It was that sentence that made Della understand how completely the man before her hinged. She took his hand and said, "Then we'll win cleanly. But first, I have to take my examination tomorrow morning." He tightened his grip around her fingers, nodded, and repeated the words like the final command of a crime lord and the first plea of an ordinary man. "Yes, tomorrow morning, you'll still take your examination. I've already lost everything that belonged to me. I won't allow you to lose your dream because of me." At that exact moment, 3 knocks sounded against the door, dry and precise. Both of them stiffened. Ronan pushed Della behind him, but when the door opened, it wasn't one of Silas's shadowed men standing there. It was a small figure with a back as straight as a ruler, wearing an old coat soaked with rain. Mrs. Ingrid stepped inside, placed a basket of food on the table, and looked at them with pale gray eyes, as calm as though they were still standing inside the estate. Then she said that the time had come for the young master to learn who she had been on that rainy night. The room fell silent. She began to speak in a low, even voice, like someone reciting a prayer. Many years before, she had been the nurse on duty in an inner-city emergency room on the night a little girl bearing the Kellerman name was brought in. She saw the footsteps around her slow, she saw the glances being exchanged, and she was the only one who rushed forward. She did everything human hands could do, but she wasn't in time. She held the child's small hand until the final moment, becoming the one who stayed, and she hadn't slept peacefully for a single night since. "I couldn't return the little girl to you," she said, "so I asked to enter this household as a servant, to watch over the family's remaining son in silence, as a lifelong act of penance. On the night the estate fell, Silas's men didn't bother to notice an old housekeeper. I drove the old car through the rear gate and collected you from the place I had told you about many years ago, and I sent the message to this young woman." Mrs. Ingrid turned toward Della, and for the first time, warmth entered her gray eyes. "Because I've watched her throughout these past months, and I came to understand that she is the person who stays, the person I couldn't manage to be on that rainy night." Ronan stood as though turned to stone, his lips moving without sound. Then Mrs. Ingrid reached beneath her wet coat, drew out an object wrapped carefully in several layers of oilcloth, placed it on the table between the 3 of them, and opened each layer one by one. Beneath the sickly yellow light of the empty apartment appeared a burgundy leather-bound ledger. The following morning, Della entered the examination room with dark circles beneath her eyes after a nearly sleepless night, the faint scent of antiseptic still clinging to her fingers, and inside the pocket of her coat was a small piece of paper Ronan had slipped to her as she left the empty apartment. Written across it in his sharp, precise handwriting was a single line: "Anyone brave enough to claim her own debt before the whole world can't be defeated by an examination." She read it once before the papers were handed out, drew a deep breath, and during the hours that followed, every night shift, every worn page, and every lesson beneath the warm yellow light flowed through her pen. She wrote as though her mother were standing behind her, and when she finally set the pen down, she knew she had done it. But the hardest examination of that week wasn't written on paper. It took place inside the empty apartment in the industrial district, where 3 people sat around the burgundy leather-bound ledger, and 2 roads opened before Ronan. The first was the road of his old world, to use the ledger as a weapon, seek out those who remained loyal, and strike back at Silas with the same darkness Silas had used against him. The second was the path he had been taught all his life represented the ultimate betrayal, to take that ledger and the whole truth, including the darkest parts of himself, and place them on the desk of the police. He remained silent for a very long time, his hands clasped together, then said that she didn't understand. In his world, a man who spoke to the authorities was considered dead. Even while he continued breathing, his father would never forgive him from the grave. The Kellerman name would become a joke. Della, who had listened quietly until then, sat down across from him, looked directly into his gray eyes, and said the words he would remember for the rest of his life. "You once told me that your sister didn't die from an illness. She died because people looked at her with contempt. So what are you going to do now? Are you going to spend the rest of your life running and allow the whole world to look at you with that same contempt? Or are you going to stand up, step into the light, and force them to look again?" The room remained silent for a long time, with only the rain tapping against a distant metal roof. Then Ronan looked up, and for the first time since the night of the collapse, there was light in his eyes again. It wasn't the old gleam of steel, but something cleaner. He said softly, "All right, we'll do it your way." Mrs. Ingrid, standing near the corner of the kitchen, quietly lifted a hand to wipe her eyes. The weeks that followed passed like a film played too quickly, leaving Della with only scattered images. Ronan walking through the police station doors beside the family's elderly attorney, surrendering voluntarily, with his head held high before dozens of cameras. The burgundy ledger sealed as evidence, interviews stretching from morning until late at night, where he revealed everything, every transaction Silas had recorded, and every operation Ronan himself had chosen to overlook during the years he spent guarding his father's darkness. He concealed nothing, shifted blame to no one, and asked for nothing. Then it was Della's turn. She sat before investigators and described the afternoon at the cafe, the leather briefcase, the ledger Silas wanted destroyed, the photograph taken outside Toby's school, and the threat delivered in a voice as sweet as honey. The pieces began fitting together one by one. The forged signatures were exposed under forensic examination. The men who had betrayed Ronan saw the direction of the wind change and began competing to confess in exchange for lighter sentences. Then came the piece that left the entire investigation room stunned. Following Silas's money led them to a series of regular payments sent to the account of an unknown middle-aged man, accompanied by legal invoices for a child custody case. Della's father. Every syrupy phone call, every petition filed with the court, had been paid for with money belonging to the man who wore the gold ring, and all that evidence was entered directly into the case file. One evening, the news broadcast the entire city had gathered to watch showed Silas Brandt being escorted from the very estate he had barely had time to claim. His silver gray suit remained perfectly pressed, but the oily smile was gone. Alongside him, a whole network of men appeared one after another with their hands in cuffs. Della sat before the television between Toby and Mrs. Odette. She didn't cheer or cry. She only clasped both hands tightly together. But Ronan's path didn't become clear simply because Silas's conspiracy had been exposed, for the genuine crimes Ronan had confessed still remained. Prosecutors were divided. The public was suspicious. No person of influence dared speak on behalf of a man carrying the Kellerman name. Every legal door seemed to be closing, until one morning when a modest car stopped outside the prosecutor's office, and a white-haired man stepped out, dignified in a charcoal gray suit. The entire legal establishment of the state recognized him immediately. One of the most respected retired judges in the country, a man whose signature had appeared beneath rulings now studied in textbooks. Leaning on his cane, he walked straight inside and placed a voluntary character bond on the desk. When people asked in amazement why, he simply said that several months earlier, at a charity gala, his heart had stopped in the middle of a room filled with people who knew him, and the only person who ran forward to save my life was a young woman whom everyone else in that room had chosen to look down upon. She didn't hesitate to help a stranger in need, so why should justice hesitate to look at the man she loves? She hadn't asked who he was. She hadn't needed to know his name. That night he had taken her hand and told her to remember his face, because he knew a day would come when he could repay the debt. He looked around at the prosecutors and spoke each word slowly. That night I watched this young woman save a life without needing to know who that life belonged to. Now I want to see whether justice can do the same. And amid those days heavy as lead, one afternoon Della was hanging laundry on the balcony when her phone announced an email from the school. She opened it with trembling fingers, read the results once, then again, then a third time, before sinking down against the doorway and covering her face with hands still warm from the sunlight. She had passed, and she had ranked among the highest students in her class. Toby ran out from inside and threw his arms around her. Mrs. Odette clapped and laughed so loudly that the sound filled the entire hallway. That evening, in the empty apartment in the industrial district, Ronan smiled when he heard the news, his first true smile since the night his world collapsed, and said, "See, I told you. No examination could defeat you." Then one morning at the beginning of the week, the Kellerman family's elderly attorney came to the apartment. He sat down and opened his briefcase, but instead of legal documents, he removed an old iron box secured by a combination lock, its edges worn and chipped by time. He placed it on the table before Ronan with both hands, as solemnly as though presenting a sacred inheritance, and said that Mrs. Rosaline, Ronan's mother, had entrusted the box to him many years before, with a single instruction he had only now been permitted to carry out. She had said to give it to her son, not when he was at the height of his success, and not when he had fallen to the depths of despair, but only when he had finally learned to let go. And Mr. Kellerman, after what you have just done at the police station, I believe that moment is now. Ronan sat before the iron box for a long time after the elderly lawyer had left. his fingers tracing its chipped edges as though he were a blind man, reading raised letters. Then he turned the combination to Marlowe's birthday, guided by an instinct no one needed to explain, and the lock opened with a soft click, like time releasing a breath it had held for many years. Inside were 3 things, arranged neatly as though the hands that placed them there had known that one morning, far in the future, this moment would come: a thick bundle of documents tied with coarse twine, a yellowed envelope bearing only 3 words, "For my son," and a small dark blue velvet box so light it seemed almost empty. When Ronan opened it, it was completely bare, except for an oval hollow pressed into the lining, the trace of something that had rested there for a very long time before someone removed it. Della sat beside him, and together they opened the bundle of documents first. As each page turned, the elderly lawyer, though already familiar with every detail, had explained in a solemn voice that this was the lawful portion of the family wealth Mrs. Rosaline had quietly separated throughout her life as a Kellerman wife, clean shares in the transportation company, from the years when it consisted of only a handful of aging trucks, several parcels of land purchased with her dowry, savings accounts scattered under her maiden name, everything notarized, taxed, and transparent down to the final seal. It was a clear stream that woman had quietly diverted and protected for years within a polluted river, preserved for her son on the day he finally dared step onto dry land. Then Ronan opened the letter. 2 thin sheets were covered with her soft, slanting handwriting, and he read aloud, slowly, his voice trembling wherever his mother's seemed to rise from the page. "My son, if you're reading these words, it means you have done the one thing I prayed for every night but never dared force upon you. It means you have finally let go. I have always known how tightly your father bound you to that inheritance, and I also knew that a mother couldn't cut that rope for her son. All I could do was sit and knit 1 stitch at a time, while I waited, and prepare a clean road for you, so that when you finally untied the knot yourself, you wouldn't have to begin with empty hands. Don't use this portion to rebuild what you have just left behind, my son. I ask only one thing of you. When you have let go, use this clean inheritance to do something that would make your sister smile wherever she is. And if you find someone who makes you want to become a better version of yourself, don't test her, my child. Hold on to her." Ronan lowered the letter, unable to read the final line aloud, and Della saw a small round stain, dried many years before, resting above the signature, the mark of a tear that had fallen before the ink was dry. The trial took place after the city had fully entered the cold season, and it looked nothing like the kind of trial people imagined for a name like Kellerman. There was no denial, no army of slippery lawyers, only a man standing straight before the court and reading his own statement, admitting to the years he had spent closing his eyes while guarding his father's darkness, voluntarily surrendering every asset of unlawful origin for the state to process. The prosecutors, holding the burgundy leather-bound ledger that had helped bring down Silas's entire network, along with the retired judge's character bond, recommended a sentence that reflected both guilt and cooperation. The court imposed a suspended sentence with a lengthy period of probation and mandatory community service. There was a price, and Ronan didn't avoid it. When the judge brought down the gavel, he bowed his head and accepted the ruling with a calmness the men who had once feared him would never understand, because they didn't know that to him. This sentence was far lighter than the life sentence he had imposed upon himself on a rainy night many years before. Not long after the case concluded, the authorities returned the personal belongings that weren't classified as unlawful assets, and inside the sealed cardboard box delivered to the apartment, among several books and old picture frames, was one small object wrapped separately in tissue paper. Ronan unfolded it, and the delicate woman's wristwatch with the worn leather strap lay motionless in his palm, both hands still fixed at the same moment frozen many years ago. He carried it to the table and placed it inside the empty velvet box from his mother's iron chest. It fit perfectly, matching every curve of the hollow in the lining. Della stood silently beside him as Ronan explained in a voice, barely above a whisper, that this was the watch his mother had given Marlowe when she entered high school, that the girl had worn it constantly, and that it had stopped on that exact night, at that exact moment. It had been returned to him among her personal effects. He hadn't possessed the courage to look at it every day, but neither had he been able to let it leave him, so he had hidden it in the most heavily guarded place he owned. with tears burning in her eyes. Della finally understood that during all the years when the city whispered about the treasure, hidden inside the Kellerman crime lord's safe, the most precious thing behind that steel had never been the stacks of money. It had been the stopped time of a little girl. Around that same period, another piece of news arrived more quietly, yet allowed Della to release the longest breath she had taken in months. From the day Silas was placed in handcuffs and his accounts were frozen, the regular payments to the middle-aged man had ended as well, and true to the nature of someone who had returned only for money, Della's father disappeared from the custody case even faster than he had entered it. His lawyer filed a motion withdrawing every claim, and the man himself didn't bother appearing in court even once. During a brief family hearing one morning, the judge reviewed the record, the years Della had spent raising her brother alone, the nursing qualification she had just earned, and the dirty money behind the petition, then awarded full and permanent guardianship of Toby to Della Voss. She stepped out of the family courthouse, looked up at the clear blue winter sky, and smiled at the thought that Toby had remained completely unaware of the dangerous current moving beneath their lives. To him, the past weeks had been nothing more than Mrs. Odette's banana pancakes, laughter over building sets, and a sister who sometimes held him a little tighter than usual. Then came the final day of all the legal proceedings, the day Ronan walked out of the city courthouse as a free man who had chosen to repay his debt to life by walking a clean road. He stopped on the stone steps and, from old habit, searched for the dark-suited figures who might be waiting. But that morning there were no bodyguards and no lawyers. There was only a young woman standing in the cold sunlight wearing an old scarf, and a little boy jumping excitedly beside her, holding a brand-new drawing high above his head. It showed a beautiful, sunlit clinic with a large garden, and 3 crooked figures holding hands in front of the open doors. Toby waved the picture wildly and shouted across the whole plaza, "Uncle Ronan. Look, I drew our new home." The man who had walked through collapse, betrayal, judgment, and the eyes of an entire city stood motionless on the courthouse steps, one hand tightening around his sister's stopped watch inside his coat pocket, feeling the cool glass press against his palm, and there, amid the clear voice of a child calling his name, he suddenly knew, with greater certainty than he had ever known anything, exactly what he was meant to do with the clear stream his mother had spent her whole life preserving for him. In the months that followed, on an old street corner in the eastern working-class district where an abandoned warehouse had once stood, people began to notice lights burning late into the night and trucks carrying construction materials coming and going. The clear stream Mrs. Rosaline had spent her entire life preserving was finally poured into the place where it belonged, into every brick, every window frame built to welcome sunlight, every row of waiting room chairs painted a gentle shade of blue. And one early spring morning, a simple bronze plaque was mounted beside the entrance, engraved with the words, "Marlowe Foundation Community Clinic," where every door opens to every person. Beneath it was a smaller line that made anyone who read carefully pause for a moment. "No one here will be refused because of poverty, background, or any prejudiced gaze." Ronan had chosen the location himself, not in the glittering city center, but in the neighborhood where people like the Della he had first met once needed 2 buses just to reach an emergency room. He worked with architects, retired doctors who still carried deep devotion to their calling. The elderly lawyer handled the legal matters, and Mrs. Ingrid took charge of coordinating the first volunteers with the same meticulous care she had brought to decades of running a household. Throughout those months, the man who had once ruled an empire through fear learned how to build something good through gratitude. During that same period, another ceremony took place in the nursing school's grand auditorium, where the most outstanding students of the graduating class were called to the stage amid applause. And when the name Della Voss echoed through the hall, she walked forward in a spotless white uniform and bowed her head as the dean pinned the nursing badge to her chest, the badge she had earned through sleepless nights, missed meals, and an entire season of storms. In the audience, Toby stood on his chair and clapped louder than anyone in the room. Mrs. Odette applauded while dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and in the final row, in the most hidden seat, a man in a dark coat stood silently watching her, offering no applause, only a smile, because some forms of pride are so immense that applause can't contain them. Then, late one weekend afternoon, When the clinic had completed its final preparations and only awaited opening day, Ronan sent Della a message asking her to come, saying he needed her professional opinion on the arrangement of the first aid room. She arrived, walked through the rooms still carrying the fresh scent of paint, adjusted the placement of several medicine cabinets, suggested changes to the stretcher route, and when they finally stopped in the main lobby, she saw it. The central wall of the clinic held no sign or logo. Instead, 2 framed photographs hung side by side in a place of honor. One showed Mrs. Rosaline as a young woman, wearing a gentle smile and eyes that seemed to see far beyond the present. The other was a photograph of Della's mother that Ronan had quietly asked Mrs. Odette to find in an old album. A thin woman with a warm smile holding her little daughter in her arms. Beneath the 2 frames was a line carved into wood, dedicated to 2 mothers who taught us that people may be poor in money, but they must never be poor in heart. Della stood motionless before the wall, her throat tightening until she couldn't speak, and when she turned around to say something, she saw Ronan holding a stack of old papers she recognized immediately. The contract, the original copy, the thing that had begun everything. He looked at her, then lowered his eyes to the pages, and said that he had kept it through all those months, kept it as evidence of the man he had once been, a man who believed everything in life could be purchased, and every heart needed a clause for protection. "Do you know who wrote the 4th clause?" he asked. "I did. I wrote it myself the night before I gave you the contract to sign, because I saw something in you that frightened me. That clause was the most cowardly thing I've ever written. I didn't write it to protect myself from you. I wrote it because I was afraid of myself." Then, before Della's eyes, he took the pages in both hands and tore them in half. The sound of ripping paper rang clean and final through the empty lobby, and the 2 halves of the old agreement fell onto the new tiled floor. Before she could catch her breath, Ronan Kellerman lowered himself onto one knee in the clinic that bore his sister's name, beneath the gaze of the 2 mothers on the wall. He opened a small box, and a simple ring caught the late afternoon light. His deep voice trembled through every word as he said, "Della Voss, I once paid you to pretend to be a woman who loved me. It was the most arrogant mistake of my life, and also the greatest blessing I've ever received. Now I have no empire and no power, only a clean road ahead of me and a heart you somehow repaired. So I'm not offering you another contract. I'm asking for the rest of your life, so that every day I may try to become a man worthy of your real love. Will you say yes?" Della's tears fell before she could speak. She nodded again and again, then finally managed to whisper yes through them, and just as he rose and slipped the ring onto her finger, the sound of small shoes came pounding from the doorway. Toby, brought by Mrs. Odette to collect his sister, and never expecting to become a witness to that moment, ran straight into both of them, wrapping his arms around them and pulling Mrs. Odette, who was laughing through her tears, into the embrace as well. In the middle of the 4 of them, the boy looked up and announced with the authority of someone concluding an important official report that he had told them so. He had approved Uncle Ronan ever since the very first day they met. The new clinic filled with laughter, the first warm laughter in a place that would one day hold so much more of it. And on the central wall, 2 mothers smiled down upon their children. 1 year after Ronan placed the ring on Della's finger, in the lobby that still carried the scent of fresh paint, the Marlowe Foundation opened its 2nd location on an early summer morning, a spacious 2-story building in the northern part of the city, with a shaded front courtyard and neat rows of blue-painted wooden benches beneath the sunlight. Hundreds of people had come, residents from working-class neighborhoods, former patients from the first clinic, volunteer doctors and nurses, and even reporters who had once written about the collapse of an empire and had now arrived to write about something entirely different. Della stepped onto the stage wearing a spotless white coat, her nursing badge gleaming on her chest, her chestnut brown hair tied neatly as it had always been, though her face no longer carried the dark shadows of sleepless nights. She looked out over the sea of people below, drew a deep breath, and spoke in a clear, warm voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I was once a young woman who skipped dinner so my little brother could eat. I once wore frayed, worn-out shoes to a magnificent party and was laughed at for them. So I stand here today to tell you what life taught me through every tear, that the worth of a human being isn't found in where they were born or what they hold in their hands, but in how they treat the most vulnerable person standing before them. and the doors of this place will remain open forever to prove that truth." Applause rose like a wave, and amid that thunder of clapping, Toby, now noticeably taller, healthy, and sun-browned, was excitedly leading a group of children toward a real fire truck that the local department had brought to celebrate, following a special invitation from a boy who had written them a letter by hand. Toby climbed aboard and pointed out every valve and rolled hose with the confidence of a young expert, making the firefighters laugh. In the front row, the people dearest to them sat side by side like a family. Mrs. Odette wore her finest flowered dress and kept lifting a handkerchief to her eyes. Amos had closed his bread cart for the day and arrived in a badly tied necktie with a wider smile than anyone had ever seen on him. And Mrs. Ingrid, the nurse from long ago who now served as the Foundation's volunteer coordinator, sat with her back as straight as a ruler, though her gray eyes had grown warm as sunlight. Pinned to her sleeve was the Foundation emblem, bearing the name of the little girl whose hand she had held until the final moment. As for Ronan, he wasn't on the stage or seated among the honored guests. He stood quietly behind the curtain, in the place where he could see his wife most clearly as she shone. The man who had once made an entire city lower its voice was now simply a husband standing in the shade with warmth in his eyes, occasionally nodding with each sentence she spoke. On his wrist, beneath a neatly rolled shirt sleeve, the small woman's watch with its newly replaced leather strap ticked softly and steadily. After their wedding, he had taken it to the oldest watchmaker in the city, and when the hands began moving again after so many years of stillness, he sat for a long time listening to that tiny ticking sound, because he understood that his sister's time hadn't ended on that rainy night. It only paused, and now it was flowing again through every patient saved, every child healed, and every door that would never close against someone in need. When the ceremony ended and the crowd gradually thinned, the final guests all paused before leaving at a memorial display case placed prominently in the main lobby. It contained no medals or golden trophies, only a blue wool scarf folded neatly inside. Anyone who looked closely could see that the final rows of stitching were slightly different from the first, a little more awkward, because they had been completed by another pair of hands, the hands of a daughter who had spent an entire year learning to knit, so she could finish the gift her mother had left unfinished. Beneath the scarf was a small bronze plaque engraved with the words, "Unfinished things may still be completed by those who remain." Late that afternoon, after the courtyard had grown quiet, Ronan found his wife standing alone before the display case. He came to her side and threaded his fingers through hers, and they stood that way beneath the last sunlight, slanting through the window. Neither of them spoke, because nothing more needed to be said. There was only Toby's laughter drifting in from the rear courtyard, and the soft ticking of the watch on Ronan's wrist. And if anyone had asked them where all of this had begun, perhaps they both would have smiled and remembered a distant night, a magnificent ballroom, a trembling waitress, and a tray of wine spilling across an expensive suit, the moment when the whole room held its breath and waited for a storm, never imagining that it would become the beginning of a miracle. Because the spilled tray of wine that night truly became the most beautiful mistake in both their lives. And ladies and gentlemen, the story of Della and Ronan comes to an end here, but may the truths it carries remain with you, that honesty may not make us rich immediately, but it is the one treasure no one can take away, that we should never judge a person by the shoes they wear or the family they come from, because behind a life of poverty may live a heart more precious than every locked safe, that the deepest wounds aren't healed by power or hatred, but by kindness and forgiveness, and that it is never too late for a person to release the darkness, step into the light, and rebuild a life, because unfinished things, whether a wool scarf or a human soul, may always be completed by the loving hands of those who stay. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? Which moment moved your heart most deeply? The closing of the safe, the cardboard-lined shoes at the gala, or the tears of the man of steel outside the pediatric ward window? Please share what is in your heart in the comments below, because every word you offer is a priceless gift to us. And if today's story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and share this video with the people you love, so that each day we may continue listening together to even more meaningful and compelling stories. Finally, I wish every one of you listening to this video abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with serenity. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next video.